Hi, I'm Senator Mike Lee. Welcome to the Constitution Line by Line. Today we're going to be talking about Article 1, Section 4. Article 1, Section 4 is the part of the Constitution that describes the process by which rules governing the election of senators and representatives are made. The times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations, except as to the places of choosing senators. The Congress shall assemble at least once in every year, and such meetings shall be on the first Monday in December, unless they shall by law appoint a different day. This portion of the Constitution makes clear that it's the state legislatures, first and foremost, who get to decide the rules governing the election of senators and representatives. This is important because it wouldn't have otherwise been clear who would get to decide. These are federal lawmakers playing a federal role. But the Constitution says, first and foremost, this is a state responsibility. But they sort of kept their foot in the door. They made clear that Congress can step in at any moment and modify those rules, given, again, that these are federal lawmakers. It's important to remember that the subject matter covered by Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution doesn't cover presidential elections. This is just dealing with the election of representatives and senators to the U.S. Congress. It doesn't deal with presidential elections. Those are handled separately in Article 2 of the Constitution. It's also interesting. This provision specifies that Congress has to meet at least once in every year and then provides the default date, the first Monday in December. It was as if they contemplated the possibility that Congress might not otherwise meet that often. They didn't necessarily contemplate that the federal government would be involved in as many aspects of everyone's life as it is today. Today it would be considered unthinkable that Congress would ever go more than a few weeks without meeting. But back then it wasn't clear to them that we would otherwise, and so they put in a constitutional mandate specifying that Congress had to meet at least once a year. This part of the Constitution is important today because sometimes people start to forget the fact that we don't have a single national election system in this country. We instead have 50 different states, each with their own election laws. Now, some of those have been modified by federal law, but for the most part, each election system is a creation of state law. It's state laws that, for the most part, decide how these votes take place. This is important because, again, it underscores the feature of what this national government is. It's not a general purpose national government. It's a limited purpose federal government where states come together for limited purposes under a certain set of circumstances in order to become one nation. It's important that states retain their autonomy and their sovereignty for the simple reason that from our very beginnings, we've been a diverse nation, a nation where there are people with different preferences depending on where they live. The Founding Fathers understood that Virginians and New Yorkers wouldn't necessarily want to adopt the same set of laws. And yet they understood that they couldn't continue to exist as 13 independent nation states, not when they had just broken away from their mother country, the world's greatest superpower at the time. So they had to come together for certain limited purposes for their own survival. And yet the genius of the system was that it allowed them to do so without relinquishing who they were and how they operated and how most of their laws were made. This is one of many features in the Constitution that shows respect and deference to each state's sovereignty and to this principle of federalism, that all is retained by the states, that hasn't been voluntarily relinquished to the federal sovereign. There are some who have criticized the way we handle elections in this country based on the fact that we have 50 independent systems. And some complain about the fact that there's not the kind of uniformity one could expect if we had a single national election code. There are instances where we have either allowed or disallowed certain kinds of election-related laws to stand. In term limits versus Thornton in 1995, the Supreme Court struck down as unconstitutional a state law imposed set of term limits for members of Congress. The Supreme Court said that this is adding to the constitutionally mandated eligibility requirements for service in the United States Congress, and that was therefore outside of the realm of authority that a state has. In other circumstances, state laws have been upheld. The Supreme Court, for example, has upheld as constitutional laws governing who may register to vote, how they register to vote, how they prove their identity, and so forth. A lot of it just depends on whether or not it's deemed within the state's authority to manage its own elections. If, on the other hand, it's determining eligibility requirements for who may serve, that's been deemed the prerogative of the Constitution alone and not something that the states can mess with. There are a few things that are controversial about Article 1, Section 4. Perhaps chief among them relates to what's known as gerrymandering, or the drawing of legislative boundaries. In this case, in the drawing of congressional boundaries or congressional districts within a particular state. This is something that Congress could, in theory, direct in one way or another if it wanted, and in some ways it has. Congress has, for instance, outlawed the use of at-large congressional districts. Congress has, however, left to the states the ability to draw their own congressional district boundaries. This in turn reflects back the view that states ought to be able to decide for themselves how to conduct elections. It's also a matter of some controversy how individual states run elections, including how they maintain their voter registration files, what it takes to register to vote, what it takes to actually show up and cast a vote once you've been registered. These are things that, by and large, are up to the discretion of the individual state. Some people believe that there ought to be more robust requirements regarding the identification that has to be presented when you show up to vote. Some states require that, others don't require any of it at all. But here again, this is up to each state, and if a state wants to make certain decisions, by and large, it has the ability to do so under the Constitution. Generally speaking, federal law prohibits the use of what are known as at-large districts, meaning a district consisting of the entirety of the state. The only place where that's allowed is in a state that, based on its population, is entitled to only one representative. Federal law otherwise prohibits that. And it's an example of where Congress can and occasionally does step in, but for the most part, leaves it up to the states to decide how the vote is conducted and to decide even the boundaries of a legislative district. These really are essential elements to state sovereignty and to the state's ability to operate as a state. Because states have default authority to operate in this area, and because Congress, for the most part, stays out of the conduct of these elections, how they're actually to be executed and carried out, states have a lot of latitude to decide things like how to handle absentee voting. From one state to another, you're going to have different opinions about how mail-in ballots ought to be handled or whether they should be allowed. The bottom line when it comes to Article 1, Section 4 is that it sets up this dichotomy. It says that the default is states get to decide rules governing elections for choosing representatives and senators in the United States Congress, but that Congress can step in and prescribe rules where it chooses to do so. Generally speaking, Congress doesn't, but sometimes it does, and when it does, its rules control. They dominate and overtake what the state has chosen to do in this area. Thank you for joining us today to discuss Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution in the Constitution line by line. If you've been enjoying this series, please like and subscribe.